The uh, the title of today's sermon is "Which version of me is the best version of me?" And I want to begin by saying I don't mean actually me. I mean any of us. Um, Many years ago, as a graduate student, I remember one particular professor who also happened to be my doctoral advisor was pretty unpredictable. Meaning one day he would be kind and helpful and then suddenly the next day he would be rude and hostile. Now, I don't know if you've ever met people like that, but it was kind of hard to gauge sometimes which person was going to show up. And well, I thought I was the only one seeing this in him. I didn't talk to anyone else about that because I was also a graduate assistant and I worked there and in the department and saw this professor nearly every day. Um, but I was so relieved when one of my classmates turned to me just before our research class was going to start that day. And he said to me, uh, referring to the same professor, he said, which one do you think is going to show up today, Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde? I felt so relieved, like deep inside, because I wasn't the only one that was seeing this kind of two sides to Dr. James. And I worked hard, not to show my feelings about when he asked me that question, because Dr. James was also my boss. But I did faintly chuckle, and I silently prayed that Dr. Jekyll would show up that day. And I don't remember who showed up that day, but I do remember, though, the difference between the two. And I share that only to illustrate that we each have two sides, each of us. The Apostle Paul likened this dichotomy within ourselves to that of the spirit and of the flesh. However, such states of being are as old as humans themselves. I know this, and we all do. I mean, even in my own tribe, we know that the ancient Choctaws believed we each have two spirits, Shillup and Shilombosh. Shillup is what is typically we refer to as our individual spirit, but the Shilombosh, it refers to our shadow. Now, this is not exclusive by any means to the Choctaws. Most all cultures have some version of this dichotomy, the separation of two selves, because it seems to be, pronounced within humankind, within our existence itself, two sides of that same coin. Now, as St. Paul rightly points out, the negatives of our nature in Galatians 5, and he encourages us to cling instead to the fruits of the Spirit as our newly minted, now dominant way of being. He's reminding Christians to put off the flesh and instead follow Jesus's emphasis of the Spirit in exhibiting love, joy, peace, long-suffering, gentleness, goodness, faith, meekness, self-control. What are these? The fruits of the Spirit. And that's what love looks like, as he so eloquently framed what God had ordained from the beginning. Love your neighbor as yourself. So this is our Dr. Jekyll, to let it shine brightest, right? However, we should not be ignorant to the existence of our own Mr. Hyde, because it does exist. And if you think it does not exist, then you might be fooling yourself just a bit. It's as if our shadow doesn't exist, even when we're in the light. Our Shilombosh is impossible, I believe, to disassociate from our shadow. Father Thomas Keating wrote of these two selves in his book, Open Mind, Open Heart, when he says, as the deep peace flowing from contemplative prayer releases our emotional blocks. Insights into the dark side of our own personality emerge and multiply. We blissfully imagine that we do good to our families, friends, and business or professional associates for the best of reasons. But when this dynamism begins to operate inside us, our so-called good intentions look like a pile of dirty dish rags. We perceive that we are not as generous as we had believed. This happens because the divine light is shining brighter in our hearts. Divine love, by its very nature, accuses us of our innate selfishness. End of quote. This reminds me of Jesus, our divine light, right? Our divine love, our source, commanding us to sincerely be the light, he said. You are the light of the world, he said. And then he also said, do not hide your light. Instead, let it shine brightly that all may see the good gifts given by God to you so that they too may worship God. I believe these gifts square very nicely with the ones that St. Paul has already shared as the fruits of the Spirit. Yet we cannot move forward unless the light is fully shining, exposing even our dark side. We must be honest with ourselves and not run away from that part of ourselves. I would even say that exposing our darker nature becomes, in effect, our strength, as Paul has already taught us that God's strength is made perfect in our weakness, right? Author and our community's longtime friend, Elizabeth O'Connor, wrote that, quote, strangely enough, we strengthen love in ourselves when we raise into consciousness the shadow side of our lives. Conversely, when we keep negative feelings out of sight, they smother the love that seems to lie deeper and closer to the real self. This is probably why there is so much pain in not loving, the life that is not able to express the love, which is so integral to it, to the growth. And end of quote. We must let the light side do its job. We must embrace the idea that we must exist in spirit and in truth. We must exist in light and love. We must let the light do its job and supersede our shadow side. This struggle is a natural one. It's displayed in almost every superhero movie and story that you know, the light and the dark and the good and the evil, the right and the wrong, the just and the unjust, the selfless against the selfish. And so it is a struggle indeed. But if we choose to stay in the light and not simply hide or ignore our own personal Mr. Hyde that exists in each of us, there is a greater sense of happiness to follow. We know that that's the formula. It's tried and true. Pain exists in the misery of hate. Pain exists in the misery of hurt and maliciousness and unkindness. We know that to be true. We find ourselves happier and more joyous when we choose love, light, forgiveness, and kindness. Or as Paul called it in Galatians 5, freedom. Not a selfish freedom, but a giving, gracious, generous freedom. And do we want to be free? Well, of course we do. It can also be understood in terms of our ego self versus our true self. Deepak Chopra says we have two sides to ourselves. He describes our true self and our ego self. And in our true self, he says, that which exists with certainty and stability, clarity, peace, and love. And it's contrasted by our ego self, which exists in this kind of self-preservation, a selfishness out of fear and uncertainty, instability. He says, I quote, "The true self understands that you really want, understands what you really want and what you really need to be joyful. It creates a much stronger, more expansive foundation for your life than any ego self can provide. Since the true self is since the ego self is rooted in fear and insecurity." End of quote. And of course, this is contrasted by true self, the stable self, the self of light, the self of hope. So I admonish us all to think carefully about which part of our own humanity we want to dominate our lives. Do we want to live out of fear and insecurity, clinging to the fruits of the flesh, like hatred and division, idolatry? Or instead, do we prefer to live into our true selves, our light selves, the selves that God has inspired and shown us a way to live out? It is the way of peace and love and joy. So let us choose one or the other to be the dominant aspects of our own lives. And many of us today will choose to take the torch of life into our hands and say boldly, I choose life over death. I choose honesty over deception. I choose hope over fear. So let us find ways to nourish this light side. Let's feed that part of ourselves and not the shadow side, while understanding that our shadow side, our shilombosh, it does not disappear entirely, but simply being aware of it there makes it much easier to manage. The pain never goes away completely, does it? But the hope we live into seems to take over and begins to dominate the parts of our lives that really matter. Our speaking, our thinking, our heart, our body. So which version of me is the best version of me is indeed the truer version of me. The part that I want to live out expansively in my life. And my challenge for all of us is that we live together in that place, each of us choosing, where honesty prevails and light transcends. Let us become that unified sense of hope that this world desperately, desperately needs. Shalom.